Good morning, order. Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. We return this morning to our ongoing inquiry into the work of the Department and its arm's length bodies, and we are delighted to be joined this morning with colleagues from Natural England. Tony, Marian, you're very welcome. Just for the benefit of our own official records and for those who are following our proceedings, can I invite you please to introduce yourselves to the committee.
Good morning, everybody. Great pleasure to be here. My name is Tony Juniper and I'm the chair at Natural England. Marian. And I'm Marian Spain, the chief executive at Natural England.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We appreciate your attendance and your engagement. I want to just start by looking at the strategic approach of the organisation. You published your most recent strategy. Just in your own words, can you describe to the committee what that strategy is and what it seeks to achieve?
Shall I forget that one,
Yes,
Marian?
you were looking at me, Chair.
I'm looking at you, but I'm happy to take the answer from either.
You'll hear from both of us,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
You'll hear from both of us. I'll kick off on that one, Chair. So the new strategy that we recently adopted at Natural England is called Recovering Nature for Growth, Health and Security. And this is a recognition of our core business, which is about the conservation and enhancement of the natural environment, which is the purpose laid out in the 2006 Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act, and that remains our core business as laid out in legislation. However, recognising that the country faces a range of very significant challenges at the moment, we have deliberately aligned our effort, which is based upon literally hundreds of statutory duties and powers, behind some bigger strategic ideas encapsulated in the notion of nature being essential for economic development, public health and well-being, and increasingly for national security. And in that latter category, we're thinking particularly about food and water security and also our ability to deal with the impacts of climate change and resilience in relation to those kinds of shifts that are occurring through nature-based solutions. And so what we're seeking to do is to brigade our resources, our powers, our duties, our partnerships behind those bigger picture impacts that go beyond the conservation of rare habitats and species, which I must emphasise remains at our core business. And in order to do that, we are making some shifts in the organisation, including moving beyond individual interventions, protecting individual species and habitats, to look at a far broader strategic picture based upon landscapes. We are shifting our emphasis to move beyond process and to be much more focused on outcomes, and also levering our effort to benefit the many partners and stakeholders that we work with, because no matter how much resource we have, we're not going to achieve the outcomes that are in the environmental improvement plan unless we work in partnerships across a range of sectors. So those are the kinds of big picture shifts that we have in mind. And Marian and I are very confident that we're making progress on this, aren't we now, Marian? Not only through what we're able to do, but support from new policies, including some of the measures in the Planning and Infrastructure Act, and in terms of the wider picture across DEFRA, working in partnership with other arm's length bodies. So in a nutshell, that's it, and I'm very happy to take any further questions. But Marian, you may have more to add on that.
I think the only thing I'll add, because I'm keen that not to say too much until we know what you really want to hear about, but I think just reinforcing what Tony said, as well as that shift in how we look at nature, which will then lead us to different conclusions, even though we might be playing the same powers sometimes, the strategy is also backed up by quite a deep internal change programme, looking at how we implement the new legislation, but also how our staff work. And I think we summarise that up with three things, as well as Tony said about working at scale, working in partnership. We're also trying to make sure we are thinking about our customers in every transaction we make. How do we make this quicker and simpler and easier for people? We're looking to make sure we're being genuinely collaborative and working in partnership. Sometimes as a regulator and a statutory consultee, that doesn't always come intuitively. So making sure we're engaging with the people we work with much earlier and co-creating the right solution. And the third area we're changing is a focus on outcomes. That thinking about, we may have a piece of regulation, we may have a process we need to follow, but are we clear what we're trying to achieve? And is that then making us reach the right judgment?
Okay, now, I want to break down some of what Tony's just said in a minute, but actually, Marian, I think you lead me on to a concern that we've seen and identified for ourselves, and it is the lack of measurable outcomes in relation to the strategy. If you are going to be outcome-focused rather than process-focused, which I don't think anybody around the table is going to argue with today, how do you know that you've achieved that without measurable outcomes? What are the metrics for this going to be?
So some of those outcomes we have already in our internal performance management, which we report to government, and of course we report to Parliament through our annual
we'll come back to reporting in a minute as well.
Okay, so we have outcomes already. Those outcomes will be refreshed for the coming financial year. And the outcomes are driven by two main things. They are driven by the targets in the government's environmental improvement plan. So we are clear that we can see how we're contributing to those national targets. For example, creation of significant new areas of land, restoration of 250,000 hectares, preventing species extinction, clean air and water. So those are the main outcomes we're working to. They're targeted to those government goals, but also targeted to our statutory duties of protecting species and sites, recovering nature and enabling public enjoyment and access.
Right. But how then do you join up the headlines there? Measurable outcomes, 30% of land and sea effectively managed and conserved by 2030. So these are statutory targets. Yeah. But how do you join that up to your commitments about raising risk appetite, focusing on outcomes?
So, well, just at the level of the targets, what we've tried to do is to map our KPIs, which are internal, which we monitor, which we then discuss with ministers in order to know that we're on target. We match those as closely as we can to the wider government targets expressed in the Environmental Improvement Plan, but also other areas of policy. And one of the things that we need to do as a department, we would say, is to have a much more integrated approach, because the outcomes that we can achieve against the government's targets will be much more effectively pursued at lower cost if we can align with what we call the 5 Fs. So that is fresh water, forestry, farming, fisheries and flooding, because considerable investment goes into all of those, and the more that we can align our efforts with that, the better it will be in terms of outcomes being achieved across the departmental suite of activities, not just what we're doing. So we've tried to embed our work in the wider departmental effort using the government's outcomes framework, which we think gives a good template for what we can do, and as Marian described.
I mean, you said it yourself, Tony, literally hundreds of statutory powers.
Yeah.
Are we being unreasonable in expecting a sort of streamlined strategy from an organisation that's been allowed just to grow arms and legs over the years?
Well, this is the challenge that we face, and this is something that Marian and I spotted very early on when we began working together back in 2019, was the extent to which Natural England could be a great sprawling collection of powers and duties and regulatory capabilities, or it could be a much more focused, targeted, strategic body that would deliver much more for the country through having a bigger idea of what it's trying to do. And so that is the work that we've been doing ever since, and I think we've been quite successful in brigading all of those different ways in which we can be influential to put that behind some bigger outcomes for the country. And it's work in progress, and it's changing as we go along, not least through new legislation, including some of the provisions in the 2021 Environment Act and what came through in the Planning and Infrastructure Act. But that's our ambition, is to get more out of the contribution that we can make.
You're speaking about a shift away from isolated interventions to bigger, larger scale. In terms of outcome for people on a day-to-day basis engaging with Natural England, what's that going to look like?
Can I give an example of a national nature reserve in the south of England, a place called Langley Wood, notified as a national nature reserve decades ago, but which is an incredibly important ecological asset that could help to repopulate the wider landscape with depleted wildlife. And we're working in partnership there with the local authority, the National Park Authority, NGOs and landowners to be able to bring in a range of tools, including biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality, agri-environment schemes, the idea of SANGs, Sustainable Alternative Natural Green Space, and to be deploying all of those different measures together in an orchestrated way in the landscape. And so that enables us to move beyond the silo of biodiversity net gain, the silo of nutrient neutrality, the silo of recreational disturbance, the silo of a protected area, and put it all together in a place to achieve nature recovery in partnership with the many different actors that are there, including house builders. And so examples like that increasingly we can see across the country as our strategy is cascading down to our area teams and our specialists who are being very creative and very effective in putting all these different bits together to achieve more than the sum of the parts.
Okay, that makes a bit of sense. But imagine for a second that I lived in England, which obviously I don't, and I've got an isolated intervention that matters to me and my community. Who's going to deal with that now if you're not?
I'm trying to think of an example that might help answer that question. So as Tony said, most of our work, most of our delivery, and we are a delivery body, is done by our area teams who work in places. So they will work with local authorities. That work with local authorities is increasingly guided by the priorities in the local nature recovery strategies. They will work with developers and infrastructure providers. They will work with farmers and landowners, communities and third sector groups. So there may still be times when that relationship is the linear isolated example. So if I'm a householder and I need planning permission for my home and that might affect a protected species, that might be my only interaction with Natural England. The difference you will feel there is we are trying to make that quicker and simpler and easier for you through things like our BAT earned recognition scheme, which just makes it quicker and easier.
That's an improvement in
the transaction,
in the process.
Yeah.
But it's not. You're not actually moving away from isolated interventions, are you? You're going to end up doing the big strategic stuff as well.
Well, the law requires.
Yeah. So there are still things where we will need to have a transactional relationship where provide a service.
That's the problem with sort of very high-level strategic.
Yeah.
It'd be worth mentioning like the operational change coming from the Planning and Infrastructure Act.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So let's carry. So there will, as to say, there are still transactional regulations we need to do. What we are looking to do for those is make them as quick and simple as possible, both for the customer but also for ourselves. So over the last couple of years, we've seen our staff numbers shift from the transactional relationship to engaging much earlier. So staying with the planning system as an example, we're spending a lot more of our time now making sure the local plan has nature built into it, making sure that a master plan for a development has nature built in, and less time on the transactional relationships. Okay. So we're not stopping the regulatory transactional work, but we're trying to put it in context and put it in place of what we're trying to achieve.
Right. We love our SMART targets in this committee. SMART is specific, I had to write it down, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant and time-bound. And, you know, you've not really got that as far as we know, but you've mentioned KPIs there.
Yeah.
Would you be prepared to share your KPIs?
Yes, we can share those.
Yes, they're in our annual report and accounts every year, so they're certainly in the public domain. Right. And they cover the gamut of the things we've talked about. Okay. Some of them will be activity-led KPIs, like the number of farmers we've engaged in through the catchment-sensitive farming scheme. Some of them will be more outcome-led, like how many hectares have we actually created because of the work we've done with those individual farmers. Well, sorry, the farmers have created, not us.
Now, I promise you we are going to come to the reporting question, but NEO you've had looking at you recently, and I think the thing that really jumped out of the NEO analysis for us was their assessment that Natural England has low confidence that it will be able to deliver forthcoming milestones for 3 of the 4 critical reform programmes, and it then identifies main risks related to that. Insufficient leadership support, senior leadership support and engagement which could lead to work being deprioritised. Not enough resource to deliver on time and an associated capability gap with an insufficiently skilled, resilient and agile workforce, which, you know, if you've not got the workforce at the sharp end, you're not going to do anything at the top. Lack of business readiness, insufficient time or resource to fully embed the changes, a culture resistant to the volume and pace of change, and legal challenges that may increase during the initial phase of the changes. It sounds like you're wanting to take the organisation in one particular direction, but the organisation itself, by virtue of its history and its culture, is not that keen in going with you.
Well, yeah, well, just one thing, just to say that we have registered at the top level at Natural England is the observation that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so we just spent some time talking about strategy, but we are very aware that to deliver that is going to be a big culture change, which is required to do it. And that's the work that Marian
Doesn't
and the
that
team...
come back, though, to the point about the need for metrics?
We
Yes.
we can assure you we have those metrics. So that NEO report you just referred to, that section is the reflection of the metrics we were using to measure our readiness for change about 14 months ago. So that was the point in the time at which the NEO looked at that internal report, and that internal report has shifted. Some of those issues have shifted, but that's why we set up these 4 big reform programs to make sure we did have the capacity, the capability, the leadership to introduce the changes we're making. I mean, Tony started off the session describing the change in our strategy. We are not pretending that is a small change. That is quite a big shift, and our staff, as you would expect, are still working their way through that change. So that's why we've got that capability programme. That's why we shared that data with the NEO, and we have got internal metrics to track how we're progressing.
Right, and just finally, your annual report and accounts. You're overdue for this year, that's to say for the year 24 to 25, and not for the first time. This should just be something that happens, shouldn't it?
So we were due to lay our accounts this year on the 15th of April. Last year, as the accounts describe, there was a major delay because of a particularly complex issue we had to resolve with our accounts about disclosure of an equal pay risk. So that is why disclosure of a provision for an equal pay risk.
Right, okay.
So that is why we were delayed laying last year. Because of last year's delays, they have knocked onto the reporting and accounting process for this year. We couldn't start as early because we were still dealing last year's. This year's will be completed by the 15th of April. On the 17th of April, we will start work on the current accounts, the ones for this year, expecting to lay in October. So it was a single issue that caused a significant delay that we've now resolved.
I mean, we've got the figures here. The delays have been getting bad. You've been missing targets since 2020.
Well, maybe just add some of the complexities
Yes.
that come with the accounting treatment that accompanies new policies like biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality, and the scheme we had for a more strategic approach on great crested newts, because these are multi-year programs that ran into complexities with the accounting which hadn't been fully thought through by the time those policies were being delivered. And is it fair to say, Marian, that we may face some additional complexities with the Nature Restoration Fund? So this is something which has been there since 2020, and that was great crested newts that year, followed by biodiversity net gain subsequently, and nutrient neutrality. And this has been a source of deep complexity.
The great crested newt gets blamed for so many different
Yes,
things.
there it is. It gets the blame today for accounting accounting challenges as well.
I mean, perhaps just to add to that, our accounts have never been qualified. It has simply been, as Tony said, complexities we hadn't understood when policies were developed. When we then got into the accounting treatment, we were having to come up with the accounting treatments live, which took longer than it should have done.
In Orkney, we blame the red-throated divers for much the same stuff. Right, we're going to move on to some questions around growth in rural communities. And Terry, you're going to lead the question.
Yes, please. Thank you, Chair, and good morning. I think it's clear there's obviously a focus on economic growth, and we know that the government has tasked all arm's-length bodies, such as yourself, with considering economic growth. And I think what's really interesting from a Natural England point of view is that's very much prompted this national debate about the environment and growth and whether there's a conflict there. So I wanted to ask, Tony, in your view, are environmental protections a barrier to economic growth?
So they needn't be, and the approach we take at Natural England is to see nature recovery and economic development as both essential national priorities. And the work we do is to seek ways whereby we can do both and, so achieve development goals at the same time as nature recovery goals, rather than seeing them as choices and trade-offs that automatically are in conflict. And there's every good reason to do this when one understands the research that's been going on now for decades, which reveals the deep dependence between economic growth and economic goals more broadly, and the state of the natural capital which underpins that in terms of soil health, water availability, nutrient recycling, climate change resilience, pollination of crops, natural pest control. All of these things make an economic contribution but are largely invisible in terms of how we judge economic performance. And so one of the things that we seek to do is to make those values and those contributions to the economy more visible in how decisions are made, and to protect and enhance those values in ways which means that development can continue indefinitely into the future rather than suffering from constraint because of environmental damage. And you may have seen the National Security Assessment that was produced by government, including with the Joint Intelligence Committee, a version of which was published recently, which revealed how nature is fundamental for our national security and how all of the ecosystems that were looked at by that report are in a state of ongoing collapse. And so this has been registered at the highest level across government, not just a Natural England analysis. And so the work we seek to do is to make sure that we can achieve both and, rather than fall into the trap of thinking that nature needs to be discarded as part of our economic programme. And many of the policies and many of the approaches that we now take are seeking to square this off. We've got some very exciting work underway now across the board, actually. Landscape recovery, a very powerful policy being deployed at scale across rural areas in England to bring economic development to rural communities at the same time as recovering nature, bringing a range of benefits in terms of cleaner rivers, carbon capture, reduced flood risk, as well as nature recovery, and also the work we are doing and have been doing now for some time with developers, both in the housing sector and with infrastructure, to be able to achieve nature recovery uplifts linked directly to the development of the new homes that the country needs. And one example, I think, in your part of the country last week was the announcement of a nutrient neutrality arrangement whereby a large area of habitat will now be restored by the Norfolk Wildlife Trust, and in the process enabling many homes to be built. And we've got many examples of that across the country, which we've been working on for years. And what we now have is the opportunity to really lift up that approach and to create more impact with it through provisions that came with the Planning and Infrastructure Act. So we're confident that there doesn't need to be a conflict. Part of this is about the national conversation we have and the level of understanding that people have about the alternatives to simple kind of, nature or development, and being able to do both together is a really critical part of what we can do. And one of the key things we would add to that broad overview is the importance of early engagement with developers. And so, for example, at Sizewell C in Suffolk, where a major new energy supply asset is being created, we've had good conversations with the developers there from the beginning, and they are creating large areas of habitat as part of their pre-construction work, thereby adding to the nature value of that part of the Suffolk coast, linked with their very considerable construction project. And those kinds of relationships early on, nature and development, what's the synergy, how can we draw these things together? That's something that we invest increasing effort in to be able to make sure we can do that.
Lovely, thank you. You get a bonus point for mentioning Norfolk. So, but I agree that example, and I did say that you shared that on social media. That example at Clyde, I think, is a very good example, and I would agree. Could you maybe talk to some of the reforms internally as an organisation that might be best fit for you, Marian, around how you are making sure Natural England is fit to support economic growth, because it is a priority, and I do agree it's not mutually exclusive. But what are the sort of internal changes that you're bringing about?
The one we've already hinted at a little bit. So we are looking at how we can make it quicker and simpler for developers to understand and comply with their regulatory obligations. So we are reforming our licensing programs and the way we engage with the planning system. So that will make, so for example, our BAT earned recognition scheme, a bit jargony, but that means the practical implementation of that is the vast majority of small developers, your average, who build most of the houses in the UK, of course, will no longer need to engage with Natural England to get a licence. They will be able to work with a local ecologist who we've accredited to do the survey and give them the licence. So that is halving the times in which we're turning around licences. So the average BAT licence is now issued in 15 days. So that's one one example of making the transaction quicker. I think the second area that we've touched on already is we are shifting our staff resource, so we focus on the cases where we are most needed. So in our statutory consultee role, we are no longer going to respond to every consultation that comes our way. There's been an amendment in the Planning and Infrastructure Act, that gives us that discretion now. We were obliged to respond to every planning application that was sent to us. We're dealing with about 30,000 planning consultations a year, and we think about a third of those shouldn't need Natural England to intervene. They should be perfectly capably dealt with by local planners. So in order to enable that, we're also investing with local planning capability through the Planning Advisory Service, and also making sure that local planners through our Impact Risk Zone IT tool can see the data we see, so they're able to make the judgment a Natural England ecologist would have made. And then the third level of change is the one Tony talked about there, that we are shifting when we engage in a planning application much more to either the local government plan or the developer master plan. So we think about nature earlier, which makes it quicker down the road, and it's more likely to have nature built in. Tony's talked about size well. Another example that you and I went to see together last year was a Barrett Redrow development, whereby because our staff have been involved before they'd even put the planning application in, we were able to work with the developer who was able to use their regulatory obligations to also make a really great place to live. So they'd put in a nutrient mitigation scheme that had become a local park with a lake in the middle of it. They'd use their green infrastructure work to create networks of paths through the site, and they'd done their BNG obligation. Forgive me, I'm going to have to mention newts again. Their DLL. They'd created ponds on a nearby farm, so that farm has also benefited by having a more resilient water system on his farm.
And the newts had moved in, hadn't they?
They had.
Yeah.
You monitored them.
We did a sample of DNA in the water, and new ponds had been colonised by great crested newts, and we're building up a picture now as to the effectiveness of this policy, and it does seem to be very good. 4,000 ponds, is it now, installed through that policy, working with developers to create more habitat, to unlock housing, and genuinely a nature-positive policy. So this is a very important example, actually, of how the opportunity to move beyond preventing harm to recovery is there if we can think creatively and get in early enough with the kinds of options that developers can use, and that district-level licensing scheme is a good example of that.
Lovely, thank you. And you mentioned Sizewell C there, and obviously I think it was yesterday the government announced that there's going to be announcements on the Fingleton review quite soon, actually, maybe within weeks, this week maybe. And I think it's fair to say that there's a number of contentious recommendations in there, such as weakening the legal duty around protected landscapes and habitats regulations. In your view, Tony, should these recommendations be implemented, and is there a risk that they'll be expanded to other sectors outside of nuclear?
We haven't seen that, so we can't really comment on the proposals that might be made. But our advice would be that there are many opportunities to work within the existing rules and regulations to achieve nature outcomes at the same time as enabling development, as Marian has just described, and indeed making the existing regulatory approaches more streamlined and easier to use, more user-friendly, is where we're putting our effort at the moment.
Okay, and I just wanted to move on one final point around shooting and game birds, because obviously in rural areas, including Norfolk, shooting is quite a key part of the economy. There were some announcements this week around what we're calling it, the General Licence 45, and for the first time ever, certainly the Breckland SPA is going to be included, and you won't be issuing licences for game bird release near SPAs. Could you explain the reasoning behind that decision, and have you considered the economic impact of that? And will you commit to publishing the data? Because I'm quite concerned. I mean, certainly in Norfolk, the barrier, the non-issuing of licences continued long past the bird flu restrictions were lifted. Those, the game bird restrictions were still in place even after bird flu had passed on. So just wondered if you could maybe quite timely give an update on that, please.
So this is an example where Natural England's work is very determined by the government policy. We are making those decisions on behalf of government. Perhaps just so our work, sometimes we are working under our own powers under our legislation. Sometimes we're working on behalf of government. So here, that licensing policy is something we're delivering on behalf of government. Government made the choice a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, that the risk of avian influenza was so high that we needed to bring in measures that manage the risk of transmission through game bird release. So just to give the context, the risk for kept birds is decreasing. We're seeing that through the DEFRA statistics. The risk in wild birds, however, is still high. So that's why the policy is being retained. We haven't yet determined all of the licences for this year, but what we are expecting is for the many shoots, the restrictions will not be a no release at all. It'll be a delay so that the birds are not released until the wild bird breeding seasons are finished. But there will be some cases where we deem the risk too high to issue a licence. We are aware of the impact that has on the industry. We're aware that they need a long notice on that, but that's the policy we're working with. It's balancing the need of that industry with the wider needs of society and including the keepers of kept birds to be able to manage disease transmission.
Okay, so you speak about risk, and presumably there is data that underpins your assessment. Yes. Will you commit to publishing that? Because there will be a significant impact on people's livelihoods.
So the information is available to applicants. They will understand the judgment, and all of our research, all of our evidence bases are publicly available.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Jane, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just a quick question more about renewables, really, and planning and licensing for renewables. There was a site in North Devon where cabling was going to come in for one of the test and demo models for floating offshore wind. Now, that took a very long time to get planning, and I think part of the issue was that there was lots of back and forths about you need this or no, well, maybe we need this. So that was one way in which an obstacle, well, Natural England were causing an obstacle. Now we've got another planning application going through and licensing with Falmouth Docks, and that's part of a pilot scheme with the MMO being the lead regulator on that scheme. I was going to ask, do you feel that that's making a difference to how that you work together, and do you think that is being successful, speeding up the process, and have you learned lessons from what happened, say, in Devon, considering floating offshore wind is going to be such an important thing?
So we are very conscious that, again, we have a number of licensing, consenting, permitting regimes. So do the MMO, so do the Environment Agency. If you laid all of those out, it would look like a plate of spaghetti, putting it simplistically. So there is a lot of complexity, which is why we were very supportive of the idea of having the lead environmental regulator, which came out of, and then was that decision was made as part of DEFRA's review carried out by Dan Corrie. So what we are seeing is absolutely what you've just described, by the regulators working more collaboratively and by having a named individual whose job is to manage the competing processes. We're seeing a definite benefit. So I visited the Lower Thames Crossing a couple of weeks ago, which is one of the other lead environmental regulator pilots. And we have seen there that they got the fastest ever DCO amendment for a major infrastructure project because the 3 regulators have been able to streamline their processes a lot more. So it is definitely working. I've spoken to the MMO chief exec recently about Falmouth Docks, and we can already see just why by bringing us together. I think the other thing that's happening there, by the 3 of us working together more as a collective, more as a team, it also enables the things we've talked about already. We're more likely to engage with the developer up front. So again, with national highways, most of the conversations happen, most of the decisions were made before the actual regulatory processes came through. So we've laid the groundwork. So we are definitely a fan of the lead environmental regulator. And I think DEFRA will be announcing some more schemes shortly.
And you're happy that environmental standards are being maintained through that process?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, that helps.
Right, move on then to questions around capacity and resources at the organisation. Sarah, you're going to lead us on that. And then
Chair, thank you very much. So on that point of capacity and resources, so I understand that Natural England had their action plan for 2025 to 26 that actually stated an intention to cut 200 jobs. I think we were supposed to find out this month in March. Have you achieved that yet?
Yeah.
Yes, we have. So in line with nearly all public sector bodies, core departments and AOBs, we are reducing our headcount. The way we did it in Natural England, because our turnover is relatively low, we weren't able to do it simply by recruitment restrictions, so we ran a voluntary exit scheme. And I could look up the number if you want the precise number, but we exited about 250 staff through that 9%, scheme.
9%, wasn't it?
Yeah. What we did, however, we were very careful that we only exited staff where we were confident we no longer needed their skills and their knowledge. So not everybody that applied was allowed to leave. We have cut staff, and we've also, as a result, reallocated staff internally. I gave the example already, moving people from the transactional work to the more partnership work.
Yes, of course. And then we also understand that the Minister for Nature, Mary Cray, said that Natural England is looking to use more automated services in order to maintain its functions as it reduces that head count. But what would be the trade-offs of this approach of using more automated services?
I'm not sure I'd describe it as a trade-off per se. I think what we are looking to do is use the automated services to make the transactions easier. The second layer of automation we're getting into is to make the data more accessible. Now that benefits our staff as well. If we can use, I know you didn't ask explicitly about AI, but we are increasingly using AI to enable us to search across databases, that sort of enhanced search capacity. And that is also something we're increasingly making available to our partners. I mentioned the impact risk zone work. So planners and developers can now see exactly the same data Natural England would. So it's automation to streamline the processes. It's automation to speed up the processes. What we don't intend to do is use automation to make the decisions. So it is about smoothing the transaction and allowing our staff to use their expertise to then make a judgment, but that judgment made by a quicker, more reliable set of data.
Understood. But you also told the EAC that you may need to rely on local planning authorities to address capacity issues. So can I just ask how realistic this is, given that local authorities also have severe resource constraints?
So I mentioned the change in the in the Planning and Infrastructure Act, that we're hoping we will bring that into force June this year. We're just working with DEFRA on the final bits of legislation that will determine our changed role as a statutory consultee. And I mentioned already this idea that we are therefore making sure that we are supporting and training local planners. We can't, of course, address their capacity. That's a matter for MHCLG and the local authorities themselves. But we can make sure we are helping share expertise. The other thing I might mention in that regard, for the big infrastructure developers, we're also again increasingly looking at how our staff, how do I describe this? You can act as part of a team. So in the past, it would have felt like a linear process, and the developer would do their bit, their ecologists would look at the impact, then our staff would come in and look at the impact, and it would feel like quite a linear and almost quite an oppositional process. And what we're increasingly trying to say is if our staff come together and work as a team, they will understand more readily what we're trying to achieve. We will understand where the developers' needs are and where the pace and scale at which they need us to work. Ours and their staff will also understand better the regulatory framework to which we must work. So building that shared understanding, but also shared capability, and making it easier for staff to move between industry and regulator over their careers and build that feeling of a partnership.
And I sort of understand that sort of trying to smooth the process, but in terms of maintaining the independence, therefore, because Natural England really should be there as a sort of a means of stress testing. So how are you going to address that in terms of with developers? I'm just thinking, because I've got, for example, I've got to go to a hearing this afternoon on an NSIP for a solar farm, which is the size of Heathrow. And it is very, very complicated. But, you know, I think there's a slight danger when all organisations work together, as much as I want that actually it then pushes through the development and the local voice is then overridden. So I'm just intrigued about how we still maintain that sort of accountability.
I think that was, I hinted at that, saying that the developer we and the developer will need to understand the regulatory framework and need to understand where there is room for discretion and where there isn't. So it doesn't undermine that regulation, but I absolutely take your point. There is that perception that if we become too embedded, you risk that independence. That is not what we intend. It is more about collaboratively working to come up with the outcome and finding a way to make things happen, rather than us saying, no, you can't do that very late in the process.
There is, you know, you're putting your finger on a real tension, and you know, if you just look at the wider picture, that tension at the moment is leading to us being asked to do more to accelerate growth. And so doing that through partnership, respecting the regulatory environment and doing that in a way which is a win-win is the approach we're taking. But it does signal a change, which we've described in terms of the strategy and the culture shifts we're seeking to make.
You have to do. And just when you were talking about sharing that expertise, I mean, obviously you've got limited resources. How do you envisage the sharing of the expertise with the local planners, etc.? How do you...
So with local planners, that will be done more through national training programs. So we run training programs for planners. We run seminars and webinars through organisations like the LGA, so the people who employ planners. So with local authority planners, it'll be that relationship. We won't engage necessarily with an individual planning authority at that level of depth. We're also updating quite a number of our pieces of standing guidance. So planners can rely on online data-rich systems rather than having to ask a Natural England member of staff. I think the situation I was describing more is where we would work more with a major infrastructure provider, somebody like National Highways, for example, or the offshore wind industry collectively is where we're looking at how can we help our staff integrate, exchange, share ideas, share expertise.
Perfect. Thank you, Chair.
Juliet, you're going to pick up.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your responses. Could you just talk us through a little bit of how you envisage choosing and working with trusted partners? So, for example, if you were working with the National Trust, they themselves, as a charity, may be under-resourced. How do you see that working?
You're right to see a very wide range of partners out there, from infrastructure providers like National Highways through to local communities, through to farmers and farming organisations, and of course NGOs like National Trust and RSPB. One of the things we are exploring at the moment, and this also came from the Corrie review in terms of a way of working, is to have a recognition of trust with some organisations who are very much in the same business as us in terms of nature recovery, and thereby empowering them to do more without recourse to us. So working within broad guidelines rather than every single decision they need to make coming to us for approval through effectively an earned recognition approach. And so we're trialling that at the moment with the National Trust, and we will expect to roll that out more widely to make it easier for organisations who are engaged in nature recovery to do the work they need to do without having to come back to us for every single decision that they need to make.
Just picking up your point on resources, one of the reasons we're doing that, it will save them time and money as well. So so we've got a pilot with the National Trust. We're also looking at pilots with the Wildlife Trust and the RSPB, where we will perhaps give them an annual licence for everything they do, or a county level licence, so there's only one transaction, which saves them time and money. And perhaps reflecting our earlier discussion, that will be one of our KPIs for next year. Can we see that cost saving for both us and them? Because they will need to benefit as well. We're very clear on that.
And just to emphasise, they're trusted partners in the sense that they are looking for the same outcomes that we're looking for in terms of the state of protected sites or the status of protected wildlife. And so we have a high level of trust there, which is key to that kind of programme working.
And perhaps if I might just make another point that links with an earlier question, we're also looking with our colleagues in Environment Agency and Forestry Commission at how we can begin to integrate that. I'm minded, Tony, of a visit you and I did to one of the landscape recovery schemes. And while the three organisations were working hand in hand with a significant group of farmers who wanted to make some quite significant change, one of the things that stayed with me from that visit, the farmers said, well, you'll give us the agreement and you'll give us the budget, we'll still then have to go to you for a river cut consent and you for an SSSI and you for a felling. So we're looking at how we can simplify that regulatory process with our trusted partners as well as with the big planning development cases.
You talked about it being a trial. Do you have a start and end time, and then will you be able to measure what impact that's had?
Yeah, so the evaluation of the National Trust pilot will happen this June. And as I said, one of the metrics will be, did it save money? The other metric will be, how has it contributed to those EIP targets? Are the National Trust able to do more habitat creation? Have they been able to make an endangered species in a more stable state? So we'll trial both. We'll trial both the efficiency and the outcome.
Thank you. Thank you. So just thinking about the pre-application for planning, pre-application consultations for planning applications, our data shows that almost 78% of them were agreed to the deadlines, which is an improvement on last year, but it is actually down from 2015 to 2016. Is this purely because of resources and resource constraints?
May I just ask, is that the NSIP pre-applications or other planning? I'll assume it's NSIP and answer it in that way, perhaps, because it may, we expect it to continue to improve. One of the reasons our planning work, including pre-application, has been constrained is because that is one of the areas of our budget that hasn't grown in recent years. So we've been working with a stable or a declining budget with an increasing demand. One of the significant changes that happened last year, we now have the powers to recover the costs for the work we do with NSIPs. So we are able to better match the supply with the demand. So if we are confident we will have an income, because an NSIP provider will need our service for a year or so, we can build the team accordingly. So I'm confident we will continue to improve that. We don't yet have that ability for Town and Country Planning Act. We are still solely using a capped grant and aid budget to deal with Town and Country Planning Act work.
A declining capped budget.
Yeah. So that's one of the changes we're working with MHCLG to try and make at the moment. And again, it perhaps links to an answer I gave previously. Where there's a development, and many of these NSIPs are 5 and more years in their development, if we are confident of the demand and confident of the income, we can build a team that's dedicated to that particular development. So National Highways, for example, on the Lower Thames Crossing, they know the individuals they will be working with for a number of years. There's a team that's been established and dedicated to that project because we're confident we'll have the money to pay them.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to move on then to questions around the environmental delivery plan. Jane, you're going to lead off there.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm going to ask some questions about EDPs and the Planning and Infrastructure Act. First of all, you've been given an awfully big job, actually, in the Planning and Infrastructure Act to look at these and draft these EDPs. And so deliver environmental improvements as well as encouraging that development. How are you managing to get the capacity to do that, considering everything else that you've got to do and the constraints you're under? Are you having to move people around, or other areas suffering?
Yeah, well, you're probably better on the internal,
resources,
on the resources side. But maybe just to say a little bit by way of prelude about the extent to which we welcome this shift and this new policy in going in the direction of these more strategic landscape scale solutions, which, as we said earlier, we've been doing for some years now, but this makes them more structured, more codified, more part of the process that everyone can see. But it is a very considerable task that we're undertaking. One of the biggest things that the organisation has had to do in recent years, and I think probably the biggest shift, Marian, in the time that you and I have been around, which is requiring, isn't it, a recasting of the internal capacity, which you're probably better able to explain to the member.
So, yes, just to reiterate what Tony said, it is a really big job we've been asked to do, but it's one we very much want to do. We've been working on strategic solutions locally for a number of years, and this is the first time it's been becoming embedded as the norm, and it is going to require considerable resourcing. So there's two parts there's two halves of an answer to your question. We have been given additional resources through the last spending review and in the current year's budget, so forgive me, in the current year budget and for next year, when the next spending review starts to bite, we've been given additional resources to begin work on EDPs. So DEFRA had £14 million to spend. So we have increased our capacity of staff. We've brought new staff in. In fact, we've moved staff internally, so the people have already got the skills. We've set up a new team for which we were given extra funding for the preparatory work we're doing now for EDPs. In time, once the EDPs are up and running and once payments are starting to come into the Nature Recovery Fund, we will cover the costs of the teams we need to deliver the work as well as delivering the work on the ground. So we are confident in time the money will start to flow, but it will need...
You think it will be self-funded?
That is how the scheme is being designed, but we are still working with our colleagues in government about exactly how the levies will be set. But we expect it to be self-funding. That's what the Act provides for. But at the moment, it is being funded by grant and aid in order to get it up and running.
I was going to ask as well, the environmental recovery development plans. It is a big job. When you are doing that, I'm taking Cornwall particularly because that's where I'm from. We have a very strong local nature recovery strategy, for example. Some places have those, some places less so. Are you managing to take local areas' pre-existing plans into account? Because, of course, one of the concerns about EDPs is that it will be imposed and there won't be that collaborative working.
This is really at the core of the opportunity, is the extent for us to be able to take that broader view across entire landscapes and to take account of things like local nature recovery strategies and to be targeting nature restoration into those places that have already been identified through a very thorough process. And as you say, more thorough in some counties than others, but taking those templates and being able to target not only the resources that come from the Nature Restoration Fund, but also investments being made through other routes, including biodiversity net gain, to be able to build the nature recovery network that we know from ecological science the country needs, connected bigger areas of higher quality habitat. And so that's where we can add real value to this policy, is through understanding the ecological situation, but also having good connections with many of the partners on the ground through our area team structure. And this is critical because, I mean, one of the things I observed some time ago is that nature recovery only happens in places. You can have as many policies as you like, but it must navigate the realities of who owns the land, who's motivated to do what kinds of businesses are there, what kind of housing needs and infrastructure needs there are, and working with all of that to create a nature positive picture. And that's where our local area teams can add real value in being able to draw all this together. And so that's the opportunity. And one that's very much front of mind, isn't it, in terms of how we get the most out of this for the country.
So just to be absolutely clear on that, the EDP itself will be evidence and science-based and quite tightly prescribed. The Act puts a number of tests and a number of, I shouldn't say constraints, it puts a number of assurances around the fact that the EDP will be effective to offset the impact of the development. And we also need the EDP to be something that is attractive and feasible and workable for developers. So the EDP itself is relatively constrained. It can be informed by the LNRS, and there will be public consultation on them, so people's views can be taken into account. But the main test for the EDP is, will the measures offset the impact of development? I think the situation Tony was describing is when we then have the opportunity to use the fund, that is when we will look to use that fund to create the biggest impact in an area, so matching it with others, taking the LNRS. Yeah. Tony described Woodnorth and Norfolk Wildlife.
You've mentioned it.
Liscombe Farm is the other one,
under
the nutrient mitigation scheme, as well as being able to tackle the pollution to enable housing to be built. We were able to work that as a partnership with the Wildlife Trust and local landowners and create what will probably become a national nature reserve in due course.
It's already, we've
hasn't been declared
hasn't
yet.
been declared, no. So that one's still, yes, it's coming.
So I think it's about that ability to make the best of the money.
Yeah.
And what we hear from developers is they want their money to go to good stead. They understand the benefit of the EDP, not just for themselves in terms of speed and certainty. They can also see they want to be able to talk about the impact their development has had on local nature and local people. And so I think that will be vitally important. The funds are spent in a way that is seen to make a difference
and if
for
it's
the local
close,
community.
Indeed, and if it's close to the housing, there's a developer benefit seen in the value of the properties that are sold. And so we've seen this around the Thames Basin Heaths, where we were working with partners locally to create significant areas of space for people to enjoy for picnics, dog walking, bike riding, running about. It's got a lot of wildlife in it, but it's not the same as the heathlands, which are protected by drawing public access to those places. And where that's close to the housing has a very considerable uplift in terms of the sales prices that the developers can get. So there's an economic dimension to this too, in creating beautiful places that people really want to live in.
Yeah, absolutely. You're kind of answering it a little bit, but the Environmental Audit Committee warned of a potential conflict if Natural England are the creator, the executor and the regulator of EDPs. What other steps, I mean, you're talking about it now really, but what steps are you taking to minimise those kind of risks?
I think it's largely the legislation itself does that, a lot of that for us, because of the tests that we need to evidence. So for us to recommend an EDP to Secretary of State for approval, we first have to be satisfied it meets the tests, and then the Secretary of State will also need to be satisfied that the EDP is sound. So the tests themselves, I think, deal largely with the conflict. We do also have, as I say, the evidence that we use will be transparent and public. So again, that will show that we have been objective in our decisions. And I don't want to suggest that we've necessarily got Chinese walls around the teams, but we do have a team whose job is to work on the EDPs. The reason we haven't literally separated from the rest of the organisation, they need to be informed by those place considerations we were talking about. So it'll be a specialist team who works on them, but they will be informed by their colleagues and their wider experiences.
And last question really is about, there's been some controversy about the wording the Act and the conservation measures, and we've come up finally with conservation measures will materially outweigh the negative impacts of development. That term isn't really specifically defined. How do you define the term materially outweigh?
Well, ecology is notoriously complicated and unpredictable in terms of what nature will do. And so I think it's probably fair that there is a bit of latitude there, but any ecologist would be able to judge whether there is a significant uplift in the state of nature as a result of the EDP compared with before. And our specialists will feed into the design of the plans to offer the best possible judgments as they're being drafted.
So will Natural England have a specific definition then, or will it be on a more of a case-by-case?
It will partly depend on what the issue is. So I think we've made clear the first EDPs will be for nutrient mitigation. The next round will be for great crested newts. Sorry, we're back to them again, aren't we? And I'll use great crested newts as the example because it's likely there can be a numerical test. We will know the number of ponds. We will estimate the population of newt. We will then be able to say the measures we will put in place will create at least that much habitat, and therefore there will be at least that many newts. Yeah. That's what we've done through the district level licensing scheme. So there will be some cases there will be a numerical test, but as Tony says, a lot of the time it will be a judgment. And of course, ultimately, it'll be a matter for the DEFRA Secretary of State who makes the final decision on whether the EDP passes the test.
Indeed, and that judgment by expert ecologists is absolutely critical in getting that extra value for society out of these kinds of investments. And so Marian mentioned Liscombe Down. That was a nutrient mitigation investment to free up housing permissions in the catchment of Poole Harbour. So this is nutrients going down into an internationally important wetland. So what could have happened there is that some nutrient could have been removed from farming, and that would have met the test for the nutrient mitigation. But what we did was to take that resource and to turn it into a far bigger impact in terms of a serious scale nature recovery initiative which will be open to the public via it being a national nature reserve. So bringing health and well-being benefits, also in the headwaters of the river that feeds into Poole Harbour, thereby creating a flood reduction benefit as well. And so all of these things have been layered on by ecological judgment and people knowing the local scene, whereas it could have been asking a farmer just to stop using nutrients, which would have met the test, but not given that very considerable uplift and all those extra benefits. So I think that's one of the reasons why, having an expert body like ours overseeing this is a good way to add value to what we can get as a country.
Is this where the rubber meets the road, though, in relation to culture and strategy and the issue that we identified right at the start in relation to you being able to bring your team with you, especially in relation to this judgment of what materially outweighs the balance? Have you got that right, or are you still, in terms of your outcome, got people at the sharp end who are blocking the development and the growth?
I don't think we have.
So where are these people?
If I was being very honest with you, if I'd been sitting here in a month, I could tell you the results of our staff survey, which closed on Friday. So that is one of the things we will measure in our staff survey: is what do our staff we know what our staff.
If you do an ecological assessment, it's always going to come up with an ecological answer. Whereas if you don't have an economic or a growth assessment in there, you're not going to get the full picture, are you?
But that's not our job to be experts in economics. We have economists. Our job is to be experts in ecology.
You're a growth department, or you're an arm's length body of a growth department. You can't be blind to the economic consequences, surely.
No, we're absolutely not. And all of those things I was describing earlier about changing our culture and our staff understanding the outcome our customers are trying to achieve. I'll just go back to your original question about where our staff are. The vast majority, our strategy was 18 months in the making. It involved a lot of discussion with our staff. The vast majority of our staff are clearly absolutely how we are describing where the organisation needs to get, and understand why that matters, because the outcomes for nature will be better. So I don't think our staff are resistant to the strategy. It'll be a change for them, and some of them will need to think about different judgments, be confident in working in that more outcome based, but there is not internal resistance. I was asked by somebody, what do the ecologists in your organisation think? And I said, well, I'm an ecologist and I believe this strategy is right for nature. You're an ecologist. Well, you're sort of an ecologist.
I certainly am.
But, you know, but I think that sense that the reason we think it's right is it's better for nature. And it may be we're using a slightly different tool to get there. So the strategic solutions we were describing was something the organisation innovated about 12 years ago. So our staff are absolutely clear that those are the right things to do because they're right for nature, as well as making life easier for developers and therefore more likely to have growth.
Kate, I think we're going to come back to this later on because we're going to look at some specific areas where you interface, or you have interface, forgive me, with specific land users and agricultural stakeholders in particular. But for the moment, Josh, biodiversity net gain.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Clearly a topic that's generated a lot of discussion since it was implemented a couple of years ago. So, in essence, biodiversity net gain should be another source of income for nature-friendly land management. But given the government currently plans to exempt sites under 0.2 hectares, which estimates suggest is around 80% of developments, how confident are you that policy can make sure that the emerging BNG market does actually reach its full potential?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the confidence that was building around the rise of nature markets in this country, I think confidence was shaken a little by that change to the threshold for triggering biodiversity net gain requirement. So we'll have to wait and see to understand to what extent this has made a difference to the investments being made by land managers, because as you'll know, the idea is to generate demand for habitat creation through compensating for damage to non-protected habitats being caused by development activity. And if you're exempting quite a big bit of it, and it's a large number in terms of the individual development consents, then that inevitably is going to make an impact on the market and the confidence of farmers and others to create units for sale when the market has been considerably diminished. And we don't know the answer yet, do we, as to what that will be. Countervailing that particular direction is the fact of there being a government commitment to add nationally significant infrastructure projects, which hopefully will create demand from a different route. So maybe that will offset some of what has been going on through the changes that affect more the housing side. One of the things we struggle with a little bit here is that the data is hard to come by, because the way the rules were constructed at the beginning means that there is no national register of all the on-site contributions that are being accumulated across the country. But I think anecdotally we would say that this has been a good policy. And if you're looking at government ambitions to attract more private sector investment into nature recovery, given the constraints on the public finances, seems to be an essential dimension, then it's quite striking how most of the money that's moving at the moment is coming from so-called compliance markets. So biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality, recreational disturbance of the kind which funded a lot of nature creation around the Thames Basin heaths. This is where we're driving quite a lot of the demand for habitat creation funded by the private sector. And so that's the wider context, I think, for these kinds of changes, is the extent to which we can retain confidence amongst those investors that the policy is long-term, it's strong, it's going in a particular direction, but we don't know the answer yet, do we, Marian, as to what the effect will be?
We haven't yet seen a change in the number of registrations coming forward for the off-site register that we develop, what you might call the habitat banks. That is still a relatively strong market, but of course it is many of the developers that choose to use the offsite are the smaller developers because they've got less opportunity to build it in on sites. I think the other change that we will be very conscious of is exactly that, getting the balance right between using the money to do significant habitat creation off-site versus the benefits to people of habitat creation close to the homes that are being built. So I think there's also an issue about the impact on urban areas in particular, where we have got the paucity of green space. Biodiversity net gain has a significant opportunity to put that right and to have green space built into new housing. I visited a development at Earl's Court a month or so ago. which absolutely exemplifies this. They have done a master plan which is absolutely thinking about how people will live in that site, how they will travel on that site, and how nature will be the solution to that. So they've taken their regulatory duties like sustainable urban drainage, biodiversity net gain and so on, and have come up with a really creative scheme. And actually it impressed me so much, I want to share an anecdote. The other thing that really struck me about how carefully this developer had thought about using nature to enhance lives. The site is between a Zone 1 and a Zone 2 tube station. And at the moment, nearly everybody goes to the Zone 2 because it's a difficult walk to get to the Zone 1. They have deliberately put in a green walkway to make it pleasanter, and they told us that that will save a family about £50 a week, and that will make a big difference to the families in that development.
We've heard that there's probably been more on-site provision than expected, and so the market for units hasn't been perhaps quite as buoyant as initial estimates were. I mean, I would say that's a good thing because it means more developers are, as you said, creating those benefits closer to home. But do you think, coupled with the changes that the government's obviously announced it's going to do but haven't come into effect yet, has that kind of dampened demand and therefore dampened investment in the market?
Not yet. I think we haven't yet seen the final outcomes of the government's consultation.
But it is designed to do that, to exempt more development from biodiversity net gain. So it's going to lead to diminished demand, isn't it? And that's the point. Yeah.
I could move on then to another topic that's generated a lot of discussion, which is, of course, the environmental land management schemes, not least of all because of the closure of the sustainable farming incentive. But I think one silver lining that we've seen from that is that DEFRA's had a chance to redesign the SFI and hopefully make it simpler and better integrated with other nature restoration schemes. So in that vein, how well integrated do you feel BNG is with ELMS? Do you think farmers are being assisted to benefit from both?
So I think increasingly our farm advisors are talking to farmers not just about ELMS but about other green finance schemes, of which, as Tony said, BNG is the principal one. Some farmers are also engaging in carbon offsetting and so on, but in terms of confidence. So I think increasingly we are seeing farmers recognise there are alternative incomes, and our advisors spend a lot of their time on that. I think where we will see the biggest impact is on the landscape recovery scheme, where there is a requirement of participants in that to bring in private finance as well and match funding. And we think that's where quite a lot of those BNG habitat banks are being created by people who intend to participate in landscape recovery.
Then we've heard that a lot of landscape recovery money is going to quite large landowners, and that in some cases tenant farmers are being pushed out of that conversation and the benefits of that. So what are you doing to kind of address that so that you're not just working with the larger landowners like the National Trust just to single one out?
I've heard that. I mean, of the 3 schemes that are now up and running, one of them is principally small farmers, the Upper Duddon in Cumbria. In the pipeline, we have schemes on Dartmoor that will bring in the commoners and the tenant farmers. So I don't think we're necessarily seeing... It's perhaps inevitable that the early adopters will have been the estates and the big landowners that have the confidence to take risks and have the in-house advice to do it. But we're very conscious of that. And I think as you start to see more schemes come forward, we will see that they are also benefiting farmers. Okay. The most powerful ones are the ones when it's that genuine mix. So you've perhaps got somebody like a big NGO or a big landlord who can not just convene the farmers but bear some of the risk on their behalf as the schemes roll out. So I think that's what we're seeing is happening on Dartmoor.
Okay, well that's promising. Just to get a bit technical on this though, BNG units can be created on land that is in agri-environment schemes, but only if it's providing further habitat enhancements. And we've heard that in practice it's extremely difficult to do that. For example, because the payments made under ELMS or countryside stewardship aren't always clear on what proportion of the environmental outcomes they're actually paying for. So through those advisors that you mentioned, are you doing anything to address that, to help farmers understand how they might be able to benefit from both and sort of differentiate the benefits so that they're not double counting anything?
Yeah.
I think what you're describing there is a policy decision for government as to for DEFRA as to how much they're prepared to allow farmers to stack their payments. I think it is possible to show that different funding sources are paying for different outcomes, but you'll understand why DEFRA are concerned to not be double funding, using taxpayers' money to pay twice for the same good.
or a combination of private money and taxpayers'
So,
money.
obviously, you mentioned that from a government perspective, the funding picture is quite constrained. So, getting those multiple different benefits from nature restoration, which is something you alluded to just earlier, Tony, is more important than ever. So, do you think, a couple of years in, that BNG is showing signs that it is assisting other environmental goals like flood management in a natural way and improving water quality?
Yes, I think we can say that it is delivering that. Now, obviously, every circumstance is different, such as the complexity of ecology, but I have personally seen biodiversity net gain that is linked with flood reduction risk on housing developments. Some biodiversity net gain is being used to promote access for nearby residents to nature, and there's obviously a health and well-being benefit there, which we can see is very real in terms of the national contribution, which then reduces pressure on the National Health Service. So we are getting a range of benefits.
Metrics for that?
Yes, we do, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we do. It's very considerable. So we can see opportunities to layer on additional benefits beyond the very technical requirements to replace like with like plus 10%, which you'd measure in terms of species and habitat. But those additional benefits, and it comes back to what we were saying earlier about our local area teams being able to get that extra value for society through knowing the local partnerships and the opportunities that come with a particular parcel of land and what you could do with it. So that's very much our ambition, is to maximise the benefit in places, and biodiversity net gain is one of the tools which we deploy for those wider benefits, but also in the context of local nature recovery strategies where we can do that.
Like the chair, though, I was going to ask about how that's being measured. How are you kind of quantifying that, and how is that going to be published?
Well, this is the difficulty with the data in terms of the BNG creation being scattered across local authorities without a central... There's no central data, is there?
Local authorities aren't required to maintain that data in a consistent way. So in time, there will be an opportunity for researchers and so on to evaluate it, but there isn't an accessible public consistent database.
Does that worry you, given that BNG is being looked at as something that could be stripped out of part of planning reforms, that you can't quantify those wider benefits?
It was a policy choice when the BNG was designed.
Capacity of local authorities.
I think the concern was creating yet another thing for local authorities to do when they've already got too much to do, and we've touched on that already.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, that segues on to my final question, actually, because as Sarah mentioned earlier, council planning departments are clearly very stretched. They're struggling to recruit and retain planners. They're struggling with the need for really deep technical knowledge around things like BNG. And that risks creating a real postcode lottery where some local authorities are able to really take advantage of this and monitor it and make sure that it's properly enforced, and perhaps others aren't. So from a Natural England perspective, what are you doing to standardise implementation, monitoring and enforcement across hundreds of planning departments?
Well, so I just start with this, Marian. I mean, the local nature recovery strategies is a good starting point in the sense of how the frameworks that are being created at county level were devolved down to the local councils. So it's a democratic institution which has designed those rather than ecologists writing them. So a multi-stakeholder process overseen by people who were voted for by the local communities. And of course this then leads to it being a highly variable set of ambitions. And so in Cornwall you've got a very strong commitment to the local nature recovery strategy. In some other parts of England, much less of a commitment, and thereby less attention and less resources. And so standardising, I'm not sure that's necessarily going to take us very far, is it, considering the different appetite, Marian?
I think, and forgive me for putting it like this, I think it isn't Natural England's job to make sure local authorities got the right capacity and capability. I described earlier the way we are helping share our expertise with planners, but I know MHCLG have got a much deeper programme of starting to build that capacity and capability. I think our job is to work as partners rather than to solve the root cause problem.
And the other side of it is the expertise that exists in the authorities to be able to accommodate the kind of advice we might provide. And I don't know what the number is presently, but a couple of years ago, I think it was right to say that 40% of local authorities in England had a professional ecologist on the staff, therefore 60% didn't. And this then explains why the local authorities tend to rely quite heavily on Natural England for things like routine planning applications, because they haven't got someone who can interpret the law and their requirements on the staff, which is a gap.
This is what worries me, though, is as you mentioned, some local authorities are doing really good work and have got the infrastructure. My local planning authority does not have an ecologist. We share staffing structures with a neighbouring council that does. So there's one ecologist that is covering an area of around 350,000 people. The other local authority has quite a large backlog of applications. My council doesn't. So their attention is kind of more focused on the other borough. My constituency is named and well known for its forest. We have lots of opportunities to really utilise BNG in really nature deprived areas that are a few miles from the forest but people can't reach it, particularly in deprived areas. So this is my concern, is that we have so much potential, but if councils haven't got that capacity, they're not able to take advantage of the BNG market. And then, once again, it is the wealthier parts of the country that are benefiting from nature recovery. That's my real concern. And so anything that you can do, I appreciate your resources are stretched, appreciate that it isn't your job to resource local authorities, but if you could, anything you can do to bear down on that point and make sure this is as equitable as possible would be really appreciated.
Indeed,
I think the place we can make the most difference of that is making sure that the guidance and the information is as quickly and readily available for councils as possible. So,
I mean,
we do.
We observe what you see of different practice across the country.
Yeah.
As I understand what you're telling us, at the moment, it's the big landowners and the NGOs, National Trust, RSPB, others, who are making BNG work. Your whole strategy is to move away from small-scale individual interventions to large-scale strategic interventions. How are you ever going to get that money down to people using the land to produce food, or is that not something that matters to Natural England?
Yeah, so the food security piece is, as we said earlier, it's in the strategy in terms of how we sustain the green infrastructure that enables food production in terms of soils, pollinators, freshwater availability, climate change resilience. So that's the backdrop against which we then deliver on the government schemes, or some of them. You might want to talk about that, Marian, in terms of our role on the agri-environment side.
But just to go back, I think, just to be clear, I think landscape recovery is perceived, or there is a
lot is stored in landscape recovery, and we've got very little of it actually up and running.
No, well, maybe talk about all three schemes. So because our relationship with the farming community, it's quite variable. We're
going to come on to that in a minute too.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
so just going. So I think the reason I was going back and talk about landscape recovery, forgive me, I'll move swiftly on. I don't think it's true to say that only big landowners benefit from BNG. Quite a lot of the land on the register on BNG is what you might call a family farm. So that I don't think it's fair to say that they will benefit. I think the question is more the one we were just discussing, that needing that confidence and stability in the BNG market to give more farmers confidence to participate.
Let me take you to the other end of the telescope then, to the rural communities, to the family farmers. They're not seeing that. They're seeing a situation where they're being expected to deliver environmental goods through SFI, landscape recovery, whatever else, if they can be part of that. They're not getting any sub-public help for food production. They're getting told that private money will come for that, and that BNG is one of the vehicles for that. It's not happening though.
Well, this is
policy. You've got the tools to drive it, but you're not doing that. And in fact, you've got a strategy that's going to take you in the opposite direction.
The tools are government tools.
Perhaps our role in agri-environment schemes, we have a delivery role in two. So we have a policy advice government. We give policy advice to government on whether individual measures in the agri-environment schemes will produce the intended outcome. So we have a role in design of the measures in schemes,
but not decision making.
Absolutely, and ultimately the decisions on, for example, the relative effort put into SFI or landscape recovery or higher tier are matters for government. So we have a technical advisory role to government as the SNCB. Our delivery role is landscape recovery and some higher tier cases. So we don't have a comprehensive. We don't overall make the decisions on what happens. What we see happening in reality at the moment is twofold. We've touched on one. We see that for good reasons, smaller farmers are not yet confident to participate in private markets because those private markets are still very young, and they
become enormously complex. And they end up just consuming the resource rather than delivering it to farmers, do they not?
Which bit do you think? Sorry, just to be clear, what's the complexity?
The whole business of, what did you call it, a compliance markets. You know, for an upland farmer in Cumbria or whatever, that's no help, if anything, is it?
I don't disagree with that. That was exactly the point I was making, because that is still a very new and therefore perceived as risky. So we are not seeing, most farmers are not yet participating in green finance markets. In terms of participation in agro-environment schemes, what we are seeing is farmers do not yet have all the information to make the decisions they need to make. They are still not. We have had more information released by government about SFI, but when we are talking to farmers on the ground, they are still not sure which is the best scheme to go into because they can't yet see the choices. So there is quite a lot of uncertainty for farmers at the moment. And that, I think, is probably the thing that worries me most, is that we need farmers to participate in nature recovery for the sake of food security, for the sake of their businesses. So we absolutely agree with you. This needs to be something that is available to all farmers and easily available.
It's in another silo, it's not your silo.
We are not the policymaker on agriculture and agro-environment. Okay. We deliver on behalf of government once they have decided the policy.
Charlie, you're going to lead us in some questioning on farming, and I think this kind of segues rather naturally into
Thank you, Chair. I think it was alluded to that maybe Natural England isn't always at the top of the Christmas card list for farmers. So why do you think there's been such a breakdown in trust with the farming community?
I'm not sure that's a universal observation. Yeah. We have,
farmers.
Yes,
we do.
We've got that from both the CLA and the Tenant Farmers Association.
Yeah, well, I speak to farmers personally, as does Marian. And actually, I think a survey we just had published, or an internal survey we did on our catchment-sensitive farming programme, where we do have some data. What was the satisfaction level there in terms of...
85%.
85% of farmers who we interacted with there found this a useful and positive experience working with Natural England advisors, and I have found that also on some of these other schemes, including countryside stewardship higher tier, and also on landscape recovery, where there has been more criticism of Natural England coming from the CLA and some others, has been in relation to protected sites, where we have a duty under the law to declare sites of special scientific interest that meet a set of scientific criteria as set out by the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, and one particular lightning rod on that was Penwith Moors in Cornwall, which did lead to the CLA and others making some quite strong remarks about Natural England being overbearing, not listening to farmers, when in fact the point of that was for us to enact the law in relation to protected areas as set out in various Acts of Parliament going back to the 1940s. And if legislators would like to change those laws, and in fact there was a call for that at the time, then that's a debate that we could have as a country. But in the meantime, our duty is to meet those targets through the tools that we have been granted by decisions made in Parliament many, many years ago. And so that does grate and grind with the farming community. And what we have done, tirelessly I would say, including since Penwith, is to be speaking to policymakers and ministers about the need and the benefits of strengthening the incentives for people who are managing land, which is now a site of special scientific interest, to enable them to be able to run their businesses in a way which is going to be profitable and which will enable them to meet the goals of the conservation designations. And so that discussion goes on. And since then, landscape recovery is now beginning to work on the ground, and Penwith is one place where the Cornwall Wildlife Trust, in partnership with the Natural England team, is now seeking to build a multi-owner, multi-tenant picture whereby people can benefit from the conservation and the farming going hand in hand through government support and hopefully also private sector investment. So it is quite complicated and it spans across quite a lot of headings. And I think sometimes, There is a conflation between government and Natural England. We are a government agency. When we arrive in the landscape, sometimes I think dissatisfaction about the uncertainty with schemes that have been talked about for years. Some of that criticism blows back on us because we're the actual people that the farmers are meeting rather than the policymakers who are still making those decisions, which are complicated and which do take time to get right. However, that frustration comes to us in a way which I think doesn't necessarily reflect the role that we have in all of this. And that, I think, would explain some of what the reported kind of reputation is amongst the farming community. But I would say that it's mixed. And, you know, we are aware of where some people have been unhappy. But also I can cite many cases of where people have been very pleased with the assistance they've had from Natural England.
Okay, you cite that example. Let's take farming rules for water. It wasn't the rules themselves that were necessarily a problem, it was Natural England's interpretation of those rules that resulted in a ministerial intervention.
It's the Environment
Natural
Agency.
No,
you were involved in this as well, because the Minister at the time, I was working separate on the farming side of things at the time. And there has been, there has been a situation where it feels from the farming community that you know better than they do, and that you are putting, and planning be another example, nutrient neutrality, major issue, where you can't replace a derelict building with something new, and there is a real frustration out there that you are intervening unnecessarily in the farming economy and wider agricultural economy, and it's impacting the growth that you claim you want to see.
I think what you've just described there is a very good example. We have 3 relationships with farmers, and sometimes they all crash in the middle. So our first relationship is as an advisor, as we've described, to support farmers to do nature-friendly farming, which is often also supporting them to enter into schemes or gather finance, and that tends to be a positive relationship. We also have a role as a statutory consultee in the planning system, and farmers perceive sometimes, it is very, very rare that we would get involved or object to an individual planning application on a farm, but we will sometimes be working with local authorities, for example, on replacement of slurry stores and things that farmers do that need planning permission. So I hear from farmers that we are stopping them getting the planning they need. Of course, ultimately that's a matter for local authorities, but because we're consulted, and the area that Tony has already described, the area where it feels most uncomfortable sometimes is where we are regulating some activities on farms, either licenses for things like dealing with protected species or the SSSI. So where those things sometimes come together, one of the roles we play on SSSIs is the main way we can support farmers to carry out good management on their SSSIs is by inviting them and supporting them to enter into agro-environment schemes. 70% of farmers with an SSSI have an agro-environment scheme to help them manage that SSSI. Where we then have to sometimes say, and we've seen this play out in some of our upland areas recently, we need to change the rules of that agro-environment scheme because they are no longer, they're not working for the SSSI. So farmers feel we are telling them they have to change their farming practices. And we are, to the extent we're saying, if we're going to continue to fund you from an agro-environment scheme, we need to be confident that the work you're doing, the grazing levels you've got, are compatible with that SSI. So I'm not denying that is uncomfortable. And we are very aware that it feels difficult for farmers. But that, as Tony says, that's what the regulations are about. Only 8% of our land is designated as SSIs. This is not every farm everywhere. But for some farmers, particularly upland farmers, where the SSSIs are extensive and can cover the whole farm, it can feel like Natural England is having a major intervention on their farm.
You alluded there that local authorities obviously are making decisions on planning, and that perhaps they're not always taking the guidance in the way it should be interpreted, perhaps, in certain cases. Is there more you can do to try and explain to local authorities that where something simple like a slurry store or replacement of an old poultry or pig shed, which would be better for the environment, should it be built, should actually be more likely passed than refused? Is there more you can do? Or?
And that, again, it's a version of what we've talked about earlier. It is very rare we would get involved in a case, but we would comment on the local plan, the plan policy for those things. So that's where we intervene. And we did that recently for slurry store replacement. We've made sure we've got the risk appetite right. What we and government and planners are trying to guard against there is that if we continue to put bigger and bigger slurry stores, we're not necessarily dealing with the issue. So that's what we were looking to make sure, that by expanding a slurry store, we were not then enabling an expansion of a herd, which continues to create the problem. But I absolutely get your point. That feels difficult for the farmer if it feels as if we are stopping them getting the new slurry store they need. But so that is dealt with at a policy level, not on individual farms.
I appreciate that point. And it's more the problem with the replacement of old buildings, which seems to be the kind of slightly illogical thing where, for whatever reason, a local authority decides or recommends a refusal, even though you're simply taking a 1970s building that's leaking into the ground and replacing it with something that's far more.
This is the work we did with the catch and sensitive farming teams, isn't it?
And actually, the other thing, while we're on that, the other thing, of course, the National Planning Policy Framework is out for consultation at the moment. And I think that is an opportunity to consider whether there is some development on farms that should be de minimis in the planning system. And not buildings, but one of the slight perversities we work with at the moment, new ponds on farms need planning permission because of the history of it was seen as a change of agricultural land. And I've seen one of the wildlife trusts in the papers yesterday saying that's one of the issues that should be changed. We should make it easier for farmers to make ponds, because we all want them to have ponds, including the farmers.
I'm sure anything that would permit development rights would be very welcome, absolutely sure, in certain areas. And I think, it just comes to, I appreciate, obviously, you've been given a direction by government in terms of growth, but it feels like a lot of things we've discussed today, and Terry's point about the game bird release, issues with planning, etc. And there's been high-profile examples of HS2 where the back tunnels, etc. And it feels like it's not pro-growth. It feels very much anti-growth.
Bear in mind that some of the countervailing pressures that we're also dealing with, and so on water and farming, important to remember that whilst it is sewage pollution that's getting a lot of the headlines, quite a level of pollution burden across many English rivers is coming from agriculture. And so if we do wish to improve our rivers and see the return of salmon and trout and other species, then paying attention to farming alongside housing is quite an important thing to do. And, whilst people are pointing to the constraints on growth that have come from trying to limit nutrient pollution from housing, similarly complexities emerging in the agricultural sector as well in terms of how we square all this off. But we are committed to growth, but as I said at the very beginning, in terms of our statutory purpose, our job is to conserve and enhance the natural environment in England, and we will work very, very hard to accommodate all of the other priorities that government has for growth, health and security. But at the end of the day, the guide rails that we work to are ecological, and trying to align that with these wider economic aspirations, we work very hard on that. But if we abandoned those in favour of everybody doing what they wanted to do without an environmental constraint, we wouldn't be doing our job.
But actually in farming, we actually are seeing more and more examples of where those are coinciding. We've talked a little bit about examples of where developers and nature are working together. We're also seeing more and more farmers. I'm thinking there are many, many farms now who are understanding that putting more nature back into their farms is what is going to make their business resilient. So using integrated pest control rather than relying on inputs, improving soil health rather than relying on fertilisers, building in water as storage on the farm as flood resilience, planting trees to create shade and so on. So a lot of the farmers, the farmers we work with, and I admit it, a lot of the farmers I talk to are already on that journey, but we absolutely accept that doesn't yet feel a reality for a lot of farmers who are struggling with their current business, struggling with the uncertainty over schemes. My first job was as a farm advisor, and a lot of the farms I worked with, I still walk around and see what they did. These things matter and they make a difference, and they do create resilience for the farm businesses.
There's a common theme running through today's question around conflict of policy interests, etc. And you said the need to work more closely with Environment Agency, Forestry Commission, etc. Would it not just be an awful lot easier if everything was brought back in-house under DEFRA?
I don't know. I'm sure ministers think about
I thought you were going to ask us, would it not be bigger if we had a single better?
Put them all together. But both models have been discussed, but we are where we are.
I think what we are seeing is we are increasingly the DEFRA outcomes framework that hasn't finally been published yet. But again, you were asking us right at the beginning, Mr. Carmichael, about our outcomes, our targets, and so on, as well as the EIP. We are driving a lot of our work. What are the current government priorities? What are the outcomes DEFRA will work to? And many of those outcomes require all of the agencies to work together. So the habitat creation one will partly be done by what happens through farming schemes. It'll partly be done by direct intervention from Natural England on its own land. It will partly be done by decisions the Forestry Commission make about flood resilience. It will partly be met by decisions that Forestry Commission make about tree planting. So what I'm keen that we see is we can start to understand and measure how the multiple interventions of the agencies come together. But at a practical level, our staff on the ground are working with their counterparts in the other agencies. We've talked several times about this stuff actually happens in places, in communities, on farms. And I think that's where we see our teams are increasingly understanding that by working together, we'll hit those big outcomes.
Tony, you said that at the end of the day, you come back to your guiding function, which is environmental. Is that not the root of the problem here in terms of trying to be both a growth department and an environment agency?
Yeah, well,
And at the end of the day, you'll always favour the ecological.
Yeah, so you could say it's the heart of the problem. You could also say it's the heart of the opportunity in being able to draw things together which appear to be in conflict and to find the synergies between them rather than the trade-offs.
I mean, I take the view as a farmer myself, in the loosest possible sense, the best way of achieving the goals of nature recovery is to use the land for food production, sensitively and sustainably. But I mean, Marian, pick up a second ago, you said there, expanding a slurry store shouldn't be for the expansion of the herd. Do you think it's appropriate for Natural England to have a view on the size of a herd?
That wasn't my view, that's what the government policy says.
Right, so you're implementing government policy that takes a view on the appropriate size of the national herd.
No, that's not what I said.
So,
well, explain, because
again,
I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
So DEFRA give grants to farmers to build more robust slurry stores.
Yeah.
Amongst other things.
Yes, so there is a problem, of course, that an inadequate slurry store will leak and cause pollution. So government give grants to upgrade slurry stores. The danger is if the farmer upgrades the slurry store and then fills that capacity immediately, it hasn't actually solved the problem. You've just knocked the problem on. So that's the origin of the policy, that it should be to manage slurry, not to continue to expand it.
And ultimately,
storing it is just one part of the management.
Yep.
Indeed, exactly. There's all sorts of
measures. And again, this is not, I mean, forgive me, the farming rules for water, the issues are slow. These are not matters for Natural England. That was an example of a situation in the planning policy where we have been perceived to be involved when we have simply worked with government on defining the planning policy.
And the
rather than working on individual farms.
The ultimate goal of that policy is to protect the state of rivers and to reduce the pollution going into rivers. And so if you work back from that being the reason for the very considerable public investment in that kind of infrastructure, then you would hope that the taxpayer would be getting value for money in seeing reduced river pollution, hence the kind of tensions that Marian's describing between putting in additional infrastructure and then that being very quickly overwhelmed by more waste to manage, if that makes sense in terms of a chain of logic. And then that is the policy which we are handed to deliver on the ground, which starts with the rivers being cleaner rather than polluted.
Right. But where that then impacts on the wider agricultural use of the land,
there we are.
Seems to be largely irrelevant.
So this is the wider DEFRA job to come up with a farming policy which integrates all these different elements. Farm incomes, food security, nature recovery, greenhouse gases. They're all there as part of what needs to be managed.
We'll touch on the absence of some of these strategies in a minute. In the meantime, Henry, you're going to take us through protected sites.
I just need to declare, as was aware to the committee in terms of my father sitting on the board of Natural England, I wanted to talk about protected sites. So you've got 5 main types of legal protection. I mean, I don't want to go through all of them. And obviously...
Tell us what you've got in mind.
Well,
Henry.
so I've got sites of special scientific interest, so special SSIs, special areas of conservation, special protected areas, wetlands of international importance, and national nature reserves.
Very good. No, it's good to have those 5 laid out, so we know what we're dealing with.
And so we've got, there'll be interaction. So I think between those.
Right.
So all but 2 English national nature reserves are SSSIs, for example.
Yep.
And so you could have a single parcel of land
Yep.
could be covered by up to 5 of those designations.
Some are.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then
Some are all 5.
on top of that,
Yep.
you've got land designated as a protected site that could also be within a protected landscape.
Yep.
So with a national park
or
national
landscape.
landscape. Exactly. And I think more than half of English SSSI land is within a protected landscape.
Yep.
So that's quite a convoluted set
Yep.
of regulations. And obviously there'll be different legislation having different purposes. Do you think in the context of land managers having to deal with those, that presents a constraint or an issue? The reason why I bring this up is because if you take SSSIs, for example, if you look, I think in 2003, I think the target was for 95% of SSSIs to be in favourable or recovering condition by 2010. But I think in April 2023, we've got 38% of SSSIs in England are classified as being in a favourable condition.
Yeah.
So what, can you comment on whether there's an issue in respect of outcomes and the overburden?
We certainly can. So, so just in terms of whether there is some kind of constraint on land as a result of these designations and notifications, yes, there is, and that's the point, because these are protected areas and therefore limiting things that would damage what has otherwise been deemed to be the special interest, which has been determined over a period of years by expert agencies, including us in England, to say that a particular parcel of land has a special interest. So the core underpinning legislation is the site of special scientific interest, upon which everything else is built, except for a few of the national nature reserves, where parts of them, or in a couple of cases, as you said, a couple of them are not SSSI, but they're still National Nature Reserve. But SPA, SAC, Ramsar are all accumulated on the top of that original notification of Site of Special Scientific Interest, which goes back to the 1981 Wildlife and Countryside Act, as amended since, including through various habitats regulations and what have you. Now, we have information to suggest that this 8% of England, which is protected as SSSI in more than 4,500 individual notifications, is not in a great state. And this has been the subject of quite a lot of debate and government target setting, as you pointed out, going back decades, in terms of that public service agreement target, which came from the 2003 government, which said, you know, we're going to get all these places in a good state by 2010. This is proving very challenging indeed because of the multiplicity of pressures that bear down on these places. Now, we have tools that work inside the so-called red lines. If you think of a map and an area that is notified of site of special scientific interest, it's very precise, goes down a riverbank, goes down a hedge line or by the side of a road, and that tells us where the special interest has been notified. What we very often find is that the problems that are causing the decline of the wildlife inside the red line, they're coming from outside the catchment. So this is air pollution coming from distant livestock agriculture or from transport, and sometimes it is waterborne coming from a sewage works, thereby leading to some of these policies that we've seen more latterly around nutrient neutrality and now the Nature Restoration Fund, whereby we can add protection or rather reduce the pressures on these places through taking action from outside. And the other tool we have on this, which we're now building up as a new strategic intervention, is the so-called protected site strategies, which enable us to get our arms around factors going on in the landscape, but which are outside the designated area. And this includes air and water pollution, Epping Forest, air pollution issues up there with the ancient trees. We're looking at how we might be able to manage that through working in partnership with local stakeholders, mostly transport pollution in that case. Hopefully over time, the rise of electrification in vehicles might help to reduce some of this. But the factors that are bearing down from outside that need management are actually quite varied. And so one place I saw recently, Kingley Vale National Nature Reserve in Sussex, one of the real jewels in the crown in terms of this country's biodiversity, being really hammered by very large herds of fallow deer in the landscape. We can control them when they come in with limitations because of public safety issues and shooting and everything else. But the bigger issue is how we're going to control those animals in the wider landscape, bringing in all sorts of partnership needs with people doing deer stalking, farmers and everything else, which just underlines the complexity of some of this in terms of how we get those sites into a good state, recognising some of the factors outside. Now, also factors inside, and these come up every now and again, and some of them get quite controversial, like the stocking rates of sheep and cattle and ponies in Dartmoor, where our science has revealed that the SAC heathlands, which are internationally important there, have declined very considerably over a period of years, despite having agri-environment payments to keep those places in good condition. That led us to change what we thought was the right management regime for those places, which then led to quite a lot of debate and controversy, and is one source of why there is a view amongst the farming community that Natural England is not operating in the interests of food producers, whereas our duty in that case is to ensure value for public investment against the targets that have been set for those protected areas, which is our job.
But talking about the condition, I think there's a requirement, government guidance, to assess every 6 years. So I take the point in terms of... But
we can monitor decline ever more closely. We know broadly what's going on.
Okay, but you only investigate... there's 66% of SSSIs are only investigated every 10 years, I think. That was a wild justice investigation. So,
4,000 sites covering many hundreds of thousands of hectares. This is a very big job to be able to do in terms of officers going out and gathering data. And that process, I think it's fair to say, Marian, this has become quite onerous, hasn't it, in a way which is not adding a lot of value for nature recovery. You go ahead.
So one of the things that is well known, well discussed in our sector, is that one of the issues that suffered when Natural England's budgets were cut considerably about 8 to 10 years ago was our SSSI monitoring programme. So our budget for SSSIs has gone up a little bit since Tony and I have been in post, but not to how it was 10, 20 years ago, when we were able to have dedicated officers whose job was to monitor each site routinely. So we do not do as much monitoring as we used to be. Having said that, in the last 2 or 3 years, as our budget has gone up again, we've changed our monitoring programme in order that we can now do more. So we've gone from 16% of sites being monitored to, I think it's 40. I haven't got the figures absolutely at my fingertips. That's what my memory tells us. And that change has come about by 3 things. One of them has come about by using technology to do the monitoring. So we can do quite a lot of monitoring by remote sensing, drones, AI and so on. And also being able to use more partners monitoring, either farmers self-monitoring or wildlife trust self-monitoring and so on. So we are doing more monitoring than we were, but still not as much as we used to be. I think the question that Tony was just starting to move into, that is reflected in the change in the EIP target on this. So we no longer have a target just to monitor. What we are now trying to do is say we will do monitoring that then allows us to start to tackle conditions. So all of those issues that Tony was talking about. So we are targeting our monitoring programme now to the places where we think there's either the biggest risk because the site might be being harmed, or where we think there is a genuine opportunity to improve it. And I won't repeat everything Tony's just said, but the challenge we then have with improvement is the factors are multiple, and Natural England does not hold all the levers to change those factors, and I can expand on that more if you'd like
so
to.
You mentioned the EIP, so I think there was a commitment to delivering up to 12 sites, protected sites, including 5 pilots by March 26.
Yep.
So can you provide an update
They're
on
in
that?
hand. Yeah, we can let you have a note of where they are and what stage they're
Quite a
at.
supplementary
Tony's
note on
mentioned
that.
2 of them there already. One of them is about deer management at Langley Vale.
Kingley.
One of them is about Kingley Vale, air quality at Epping. So there are several, and we're happy to provide that information.
And does that on those 12 sites, does that come back to what you were saying earlier, Tony, in respect of you can't control what's outside?
Yeah.
Okay.
We've got relatively weak levers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what those pilots will look at first, they're not pilot. What we would do with those strategies, these new powers we had under the Environment Act, They then give us a framework to start talking to partners who can make a difference that we can't. So start talking to local authorities about planning policies, start talking to farming groups about changes, start talking to the water companies about where they target their effort. So it's about providing a partnership approach because of the multiple factors that undermine SSSI condition.
Okay, I want to talk about the monitoring marine protected areas as well on this point. So I think there's been a recommendation that sentinel sites are identified in the MAP network and used for monitoring. So I wanted to ask whether you agree with that recommendation from the OEP, the Office of Environmental Protection, and if so, how that would work in practice.
So in a similar vein to how I described SSSIs, we are not as far advanced in marine protected areas monitoring as we'd like to be. And I think exactly that type of recommendation from OEP is what we are now looking at. There is also a danger with some of the monitoring regimes that stem from legislation and notifications that are more than a quarter of a century old. There's a danger we fall into monitoring what was there 25, 50 years ago, and we need a more dynamic and forward-looking regime. So the idea of sentinel sites absolutely fits with that. The fact that we're trying to understand better, are these SSSIs functioning as ecosystems, not just measuring whether or not an animal or a plant that was there 50 years ago is still there. It's a slightly more nuanced approach now.
It's changing very quickly. The impacts of climate change, return of the bluefin tuna, vast numbers of octopus being caught off the coast of Cornwall at the moment, change migration patterns for some other fish that are targeted by the industry. This is all mackerel, for example. It creates an incredibly fast-moving situation that doesn't lend itself. And the same is true on land to a large extent, is that the species mix that you might have had in the 1980s on a site of special scientific interest. In fact, I saw one of these recently on Exmoor, where a site that was notified for the high brown fritillary, kind of butterfly, it's not been seen since about 3 years after that SSSI was notified in the 1980s. That site now is unfavourable because one of the key features is absent, and it could have been a natural fluctuation in the local population. It could have been a disease hit an isolated population. It could have been that the climate has changed. And so there are quite a lot of factors to bear in mind as we're looking at these raw statistics, and the need for us, therefore, if we're going to make sense of this, for a credible programme of nature recovery to start building in flexibility and dynamism and just thinking about the changing world that we live in, and that it's not going to be a linear journey between there being these sets of interests and features that were notified long ago and recovering those at some point in the near future against a target. It doesn't really work like that. We're going to need to take much more flexible and approaches that are anticipating some quite big change that's going on, which we're seeing now. I mean, agriculture's seeing this already in terms of the kind of extreme weather that you would expect to come with the climate models. Nature is responding similarly, sometimes in quite dramatic ways, with species turning up here that we've not known. Great white egret now breeding through England, wasn't here 20 years ago. Bluefin tuna has come back. The spoonbill just arrived back in the east of England. I mean, these are big changes. And that clunky old regime of what's interesting and can we draw a line on a map, it's still important, but we're going to need to go beyond that if we're going to succeed with what we need to do.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time and I've got a bit more to cover. So I want to move on to the protected sites with designation, and particularly the point that Charlie's talked about, but not necessarily totally with farmers, but more with landowners. And the relationship between Natural England and landowners in respect of designation. I think we had, in 2023, Minette Batters described you as judge and jury when it comes to designating protected sites. And there have been other comments in respect of the scrutiny of Natural England. Can I ask how you would respond to those statements in terms of the lack of scrutiny and of that designation process?
Well, we've been doing it for 80 years. I guess the difference between then and now is that the country is becoming ever more crowded and ever more demands on land and sea. And so, the clash of interests that occur between these long-term nature goals and other interests in the landscape, I think they're becoming more pronounced. And, government may wish to look at the model that was invented literally in the 1950s and 40s and decide whether it's up to date. We would argue that we operate this in a fair and scientifically informed manner. If there's a better way of doing it, then we're very happy to hear from ministers about what that could be and to advise them on how it could be made more efficient and more effective. But I think there's a range of views, I think it's fair to say.
I mean, it's just that you've got the CLA, the NFU, RSPB, all questioning the clarity and detail of the evidence used for designations. I mean, that was in the report published. Well, the OEP published a review into the implementation of laws, and that was note in terms of an outcoming of that. So, I mean, is that?
Yeah, coming from very different perspectives. The RSPB thinks we should do more and go faster. Some of the other interests you've mentioned there object to there being official notifications that affect land use choices. And so, you can cite the different organisations, but important to note they're coming from different places.
Yeah, but I guess the point is right, the RSPB will take a different perspective from the CLA, but they're both saying the same thing.
So is it the same thing?
Well, no, sure, but it's about the...
They're saying something different, I think.
Well, sure, because they'll be having their own particular axe to grind or political perspective to convey, but the underpinning of it, though, is that they don't feel that there's a sufficient clarity in respect to the processes that when we talked about outcomes, but in terms of the detail that's underpins these.
So the processes are laid out in law in terms of the legal framework, and then the scientific criteria are laid out by the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, which publishes guidance for all 4 of the countries of the United Kingdom.
I think what we are seeing here is, we alluded to it earlier, so let me sort of make it clear as well. An SSSI is the one time in which Natural England does effectively take decisions over land use. So it is a very strong power, and we are very aware of that. So if we designate an SSSI, we are putting constraints on what that landowner, be that private, public or third sector landowner, we are then creating a framework of rules that landowner must work to. And that is inevitably going to be controversial. But as Tony has said, I mean, the other thing, lifting this back up, the protection of places, certain places for nature, those 5 that you listed, plus the marine versions of all of those, they are still firmly embedded in the government's environmental strategy. So the laws still stand. They've been reinforced through the EIPs, the EIP targets. They're reinforced in government's international commitment to protect and manage 30% of our land for nature. That's not all SSSIs, by the way, but the SSSIs are part of what will add up to that. So I hear what you're saying, but I think it's worth just, the context is the nation has decided that some parts of our land, not just countryside, some parts of our land and sea are important enough to require an extra protection, and we have been given the powers and the responsibilities to carry those out. Now, that doesn't mean that is always comfortable for other people. It doesn't mean we always communicate that well, but I think the basic processes we work to are heavily constrained by law and guidance, and we have never been found to have breached those laws and guidances. I think what we have learned, including and particularly from Penwith, is are we able to explain clearly enough to a farmer what it means for a farmer rather than just what it means for nature. So that is the main takeaway for me from Penwith. We didn't spend enough time explaining what it meant to a farm. We did our job of talking about what it meant for nature.
Yeah, so if we can just build on that a second, because in terms of SSSIs and the management of those, with the list that you've got of operations requiring Natural England's consent, right, and particularly around time limiting a consent. So you've got, you can give consent with conditions, or you can refuse consent. Yeah. But if you grant consent and you withdraw it, there's a compensatory payment. But if you time limit, don't need to make those payments. So if you're giving time limiting consent, that's we've heard from farmers as a committee that's challenging.
I understand that, but that isn't. We're talking specifically about Penwith here. Let me use
I'm
that
not
as an
talking.
example.
I'm talking more broadly about.
If we give a time-limited consent, it is because we are waiting to see what might happen. So there's a strong ecological concept called adaptive management. We aren't always going to know how nature responds for all of the reasons we've described. Nature is changing, climate changes. So if we give a time-limited consent, it is often because we say, let's see what it's like in 5 or 10 years' time. Let's work together. Let's understand what this management regime is creating. And if it isn't the right regime, we will need to change it. You are right, we don't have to pay compensation on time-limited consents, but there aren't actually that many of those. The norm is a consent, unless, as I say, there's a reason for us wanting to be able to pause or watch and wait a bit.
I mean, because in terms of the impact on the landowner, farmer landowner, in designation, you're prevented from considering economic or social impacts. It's purely on scientific evidence in respect of designation. Now, the impact, right, in terms of the availability of funding for those land managers would be the higher tier countryside stewardship. So there's no additional funding apart from that.
No.
Do you think that's enough support for businesses?
No, we don't, and we've made that point repeatedly to ministers.
Higher tier is the main way in which most farmers receive their funding, but it doesn't work for all of them, and it doesn't always work for all of the farmers because it's forcing them to take a choice on a scheme they might not otherwise have chosen. But it also doesn't always work for nature because the rules are not always as flexible as we'd like them to be. I think just going back to your earlier point that just to be clear, so the legislation is very clear that it's a little bit like the conversation we had about EDPs. The legislation is very clear that it is a scientific test. It is a scientific test that tells us whether or not a piece of land meets the criteria, and that isn't then. We don't at that stage take into account socioeconomic impacts at the point of designation. All of the subsequent decisions do. So the designation is simply writing the red line on the map. All of the decisions we then make about consenting, about our statutory advice on planning that might affect, in those we do take account of socioeconomic. And in those, going back to the judge and jury comment, for consents there is an appeals process. We aren't the judge and jury. So we are to make the designation, but we aren't for all of the consequential decisions that flow from that.
If we stick on funding, I promise you I have no time. Do you think the schemes in respect of we've got the higher tier legacy, high level stewardship schemes and landscape recovery, do you think they're sufficient to meet the EIP, Environmental Improvement Plan targets?
Probably not, don't we, in terms of the scale of what we're going to get out of countryside stewardship. It needs to be bigger, I think, is what quite a lot of analysis tells us, that we need more farmers to be in that, and it's going to require, therefore, more resources to do that. But the fact of that being a key tool for protected sites is right.
And I think landscape recovery is more likely to support recovery of protected sites because it is a more flexible scheme. We can negotiate the details, we can change those details over time. So one of the schemes on Dartmoor is being made exactly on that premise. We will make some changes, we will then pause and we will agree again if we need to change it. Whereas higher tier, you sign up to a more constrained set of rules and you sign up for 10 years with little ability to change as we go.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Henry. We are running late. We did start late. I've got some questions on peat and moorland management that I would like to take maybe just 10 minutes on if we can before we finish. And since we're reminding people of interests, I should say that my own family farm sits in an SSSI, SAC, SPA, and a lot of that is peat and moorland management. It's firth of your jurisdiction, so it's not strictly speaking declarable, but it does have a material bearing, in my view, in some of these things. But Terry's going to lead the questioning.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I did just want to touch on peatlands in particular, because I think there are some particularly difficult circumstances for peatlands. I was just really struck by Henry's point there, and I think, Tony, you described the management of SSSI as challenging. I mean, we've not seen any major improvement in the condition of SSSIs for years, and we haven't just missed the 95% target, we are significantly off that target. I mean, it's not challenging, this is dreadful, frankly.
Well, it's a very significant set of pressures that are bearing down on these on these sites, not all of which we're in a position to manage.
Yeah, and I get that, and I have huge sympathy with your position, but as somebody that's passionate about the environment, I'm sort of summarised as, not me, Gov. I get that, but that would have been the case when the target was set. We've known some of these sites would have been, the factors would have been out of natural wilderness control, without the government's control. In the case of peatlands, it's climate change really is one of the biggest risks, which was certainly out of your control. I'm not going to hold you to account for that. So I do get that, but I am very frustrated about some of those figures.
I hate you to think we were saying it's out of our control, we're going to stop trying. I think what we've talked about just now about having different approach to protected site strategies, about being able to work with government to evolve the ELM scheme. So there are things we can do.
Policy.
And even some of the things we're seeing through the water reforms, that is more likely to mean we have the tools. A new water regulator will hopefully bring in more tools to tackle the water pollution impact that are affecting many of our SSSO. So we're not giving up.
No, we're not giving up.
But this is a long-term game, and as Tony says, it requires us to maybe have a slightly different definition of what success feels like. It isn't just having the site as it was 50 years ago. It is having the site providing the ecosystem service and the public benefit we need today. So we may be slightly shifting the baseline in order to, and that may help us achieve the goal as well.
Just on peatlands then, because they will, a lot of the peatlands will be in the unfavourable category.
Yeah.
They are.
And peat burning in particular, and there's been a lot of controversy about that. And there's a concern that your restrictions on peat burning will lead to an increase in wildfires. Is that a concern that you recognise?
We've heard that from stakeholders quite a lot, and there have been some quite dramatic fire incidents over the last couple of years, which do really underline the extent to which we now face more hazard as a result of climate change. One important question to ask, however, is to what extent that fire risk is exacerbated through the management that's going on now, and whether different management might help to reduce that fire risk in the future. And to put it bluntly, making the peat wetter is one of the ways in which you can make it more resilient to a whole range of factors, including obviously fire. And to that extent, engaging in a conversation with people who are managing peatlands for a whole range of different purposes about how we might get those places to hold more water is a key part of what we are seeking to do. But important to just look at the factors that have caused peatland change and degradation over the last decades, drainage activities, some of which funded with public money from the middle of the last century, actually going back to Victorian times, the extent to which uplands have been made more suitable for grazing through that kind of drainage, but then the additional pressure coming from grazing, and then management for sporting purposes, which has involved rotational burning, and these factors coming together alongside climate change to create this degraded ecosystem, which now is showing in terms of the reasons for notification as sites of special scientific interest and SAC, raising questions about how we might change management practices. And we've advised government on this, and government chose to implement new regulations, which were amended last year, weren't they, in terms of the restriction on the burning side. But that's just one tool amongst a range of others which are being deployed across the landscape, including the Peatland Capital Grant Scheme, which we lead on behalf of DEFRA, which has now led to 30,000 hectares of peatland getting into restoration management, including holding more water in those places, and some areas now also benefiting from these new landscape recovery programs, one of which has been mentioned already a couple of times in Dartmoor, where there's particular challenges there with the ecosystem and the interface between agriculture and peatlands. But peatlands does emerge as a huge priority in England because blanket bog is a globally rare habitat. We've got a significant proportion of it here. It's not only important for biodiversity, but also for water quality, for flood risk reduction, and also as a carbon store. So it makes every good reason to prioritise effort to get these places into good management, which is what we're working on. But it's far from straightforward, like everything else we've talked about today.
So I'm pleased to hear it's a priority. And I assume, given the changes that you've described, there are a number of different changes, you'll be monitoring what impact they have, and will you commit to publishing that assessment? Because this has been controversial, but we want to make sure.
Just before I say yes, what is already in the public domain is the condition of them SSSIs, the restoration programmes that Tony's described. Were you thinking of something in particular?
Well, I think specifically around the changes to burning licences, around actually, is that working? That's really what we want to know, because.
That will be a matter in which DEFRA will, as they do with all of their policies, evaluate its impact.
Okay.
So again, we will talk to our colleagues in DEFRA just to absolutely test when that's going to happen.
Okay.
But I think, and I've just realised, Tony, your description of peat, your point about wildfire. I think the conversations I've had with a lot of both upland land managers and also academics working in this world, the big change there, if you look at the statistics, University of Exeter have done a lot of good work on this, the incident of fires now is correlated to climate change.
Yes.
So it is not a simple factor of saying it's because we have changed the way we burn, it is all of those. And I think what we are very aware of, the measures that we've just described to restore that peat, this is a 10 or 20 year issue, and there will therefore be the risk of incidents of wildfire as we go through the transition. So I think we also need to be looking at other ways of preventing wildfire. In fact, one of my colleagues would say there is no such thing as wildfire in England. All of those fires are started by three things: man, woman or child. It's the sort of mantra. So there's something about how do we bring in better wildfire prevention or fire prevention, and how do we also make sure we have resources so we can tackle the wildfires which are inevitably going to happen. We've had 2 on our nature reserves, and so we don't underestimate the impact on nature and on the people involved in tackling them.
Yeah, I completely understand there's a lot of variables involved. That said, in some cases it might be necessary to support burning. Do you support land managers to apply for permits when burning is necessary?
One of the factors that allows, but one of the DEFRA are the decision makers on the licences, but one of the reasons they can grant a licence is if there is burning to create, for example, wildfire breaks as part of a wildfire management scheme. So it isn't burning in isolation, but if it is part of a feasible wildfire prevention scheme, yes, a burning licence are granted for that.
Thank you. Did you want to do the uplands bit? Or?
I hadn't actually thought about that, but I've got my own questions if you want to just carry on, or if you...
Sure. Being from Norfolk, I don't know a lot about uplands. Aren't
you from Norfolk?
Yes. We've heard that Natural England is keen to reduce grazing animals in some upland areas, and you touched upon that in one of your answers earlier. And I think it goes back to Charlie's point around farming and that balance with food security. Does Natural England favour destocking, and if so, what evidence is it using to justify its position?
I think probably fairer to say, I mean, if we're thinking of Dartmoor, it's not,
Cumbria.
And Cumbria, it's often changing grazing practices rather than ending them. And so very often it's the time of year, the combination of cattle versus sheep, and in some cases ponies, never mind wild deer, which are sometimes in the mix. So being able to understand the effects of all of that, again, in relation to the special interest of the protected sites, many of which are not in a favourable condition, sometimes because of the grazing practices which we deem necessary to alter in order to restore the special interest. And so that's the context for some of the conversations that are going on, and the one that really has been a national discussion is the one affecting Dartmoor and the commons there, and the extent to which we've got this complex interplay of not only grazing pressures which are causing the interest to decline, but also the effects of climate change in terms of drought and volatility in the rainfall, but also the effects of long-distance air pollution, so nitrogen falling out of the atmosphere, which helps to favour different kinds of vegetation compared to that which is deemed to be in the special interest, and all of this having a cascade of consequences seen in the decline of once widespread and common upland birds like windchat and ring-ouzel, and this then is deemed to be quite a serious ecological problem that requires a remedy, which then brings us into a discussion about how best to enable the farming communities to go from A to B in a way which is going to make sense for their farm businesses and secure value for money for the taxpayer who is paying for the environmental payments to achieve the outcomes that are presently not being achieved. So what we would ideally like to see is thriving farm businesses, food production, and the nature recovering, and we are working very hard on that with the land use management group that came in the wake of the Thurston review, which was an official ministerial commissioned review of the Dartmoor situation in 21 or 22, wasn't it? And so that land use management group is a forum bringing together the different interests on Dartmoor. We're working closely with that, and also with the conception of a new landscape recovery project which will cover a large area of these affected lands, led by the Duchy of Cornwall, that one, isn't it? And so there's a lot going on there, but it is complicated, and it's complicated like all the things we're discussing today at three levels. Ecologically, it's complicated. What is the dynamic that's going to lead to the recovery of those birds? Economically, it's complicated in terms of what is the mix of activities that these farmers can make to achieve a living, and then it's legally complicated in terms of how we discharge all of these different tools and how we get value for the taxpayer. And so we're trying to put all of those three complicated subjects into one even more complicated big subject to arrive at what we hope will be a solution for the communities of Dartmoor, the farmers, at the same time as bringing back its unique wildlife. And that is work in progress, which we are working very hard on right now.
And just building on that, not just Dartmoor, on uplands as well. I think the other place, we talked earlier about opportunities for farmers to benefit from other types of finance. Uplands is probably where those farmers have the biggest benefit, because there are so many other public goods that private companies are willing to pay for. So we talked about peat and carbon. I think that is where we will see it in lowland peat, but we will see it in places like the Fens. We will see it probably first in the uplands. And we've seen for about a decade now, and continuing, water companies are increasingly looking to pay farmers for the service of either cleaning up water or storing water. So I think if we can get this right, if we can come to an understanding about how we best manage our uplands, the business opportunities for farmers are pretty close to the surface.
Okay.
And that's why we're quite pleased to have landscape recoveries in many of these big, because that again, that's a way of just helping the farmers come together and share the burden and share the risk of trying to navigate the financial complexities.
And finally, on Dartmoor specifically, it has been difficult. And thinking about it from a public relations point of view, do you have a plan to mend bridges in that area?
I think we hope we already have. The feedback we're getting is we have. One of the ways we have mended the bridges is simply having more staff on the ground. Again, I'm not going to go back to conversations about resources. Our staffing in Dartmoor shrank from 10 to 1 in that period in the late 90s, early 2010s, when our budget was cut very severely. That was those staff on the ground were cut in the years, I can't remember, I've got my dates all mixed up.
No,
the 2010s, it was the 2010s that Natural England had its budget cut.
90% reduction in staff there, which has consequences.
We're going to need to bring this to an end just before we do that. I understand then that heather burning, moorland burning, can be part of good moorland management, and not just for the purpose of creating a fire break, or is that the only reason for which you would consent?
So the government rules set out the reasons in which consent will be given. So sometimes it will be if there is no alternative, if cutting is impossible. I think would struggle.
What we heard from Imperial College when we visited was that yes, reweighting is important, but burning still plays an important role. It creates the mosaic of habitats that you don't get if you just leave your peat to grow, and your heather to grow, But surely also if you leave your heather to grow so that it's waist deep, then you're leaving a massive vegetation above the ground, which is what happens then. That generates the heat that goes down into the peat when it burns in a wildfire.
So there are other ways of managing heather beyond burning. Cutting and grazing are also ways of managing the heather. I think the second thing I'd say is, in time, if the moor is wetted, the heather will not reach that stand. The ecosystem will start to change, and the heather will. What we have at the moment, we're moving to a monoculture of heather.
Hill, though.
You can, and we have.
In which point, look, I think what we're touching on here is that there's a range of views within the science, and there are some of the academics working in this area who feel that they don't get a fair crack of the whip from Natural England and other government agencies. I met recently with two scientists from the University of York. As it happened, one of them emailed me yesterday, and I'm just going to read so you can hear his view. I finished my assessments of 3 key Natural England reports: heather cutting, and he gives the reference numbers, heather cutting, heather burning, and definition of favourable conservation status for blanket bog, and have some serious concerns about their methodology and quality. However, I have not been successful in finding the right route to raise my concerns so they can be considered by policymakers and or independently assessed. So he's opening his work for independent assessment. My conclusions are that policy is being misinformed or crucial aspects of peatland management and resilience to wildfire and climate change impacts. Does that not worry you?
I'm not aware of that letter. They
well, no,
haven't
you're not,
tried.
Because it
that
just came to me
individual
on
has
email
not tried
yesterday.
to contact me or Tony at the top of Natural
I've
England.
not seen it either.
But we hear versions of that, so I'd give you two comments. One is we carry out regular reviews of all of the evidence, and we publish
clearly
the most
familiar
recent.
with the academics at
I know the York University team. I want to take up to a bigger.
Here?
I wanted to go to your earlier point about needing to create a mosaic of habitats. I think that's the point, and I think that's where some of the science will show you that to create a mosaic of habitat, you need a mosaic of different management, which might involve burning. Our view, however, is there are other ways of creating that mosaic that don't have the negative impacts that burning has. Burning is principally used...
Much of your thinking here is informed by the views of some of the NGOs in relation to driven grouse moors.
Absolutely not at all.
That's no influence on you at all?
No, our science is based on the best available evidence. Okay. The point I was just going to finish, burning practices in uplands are relatively recently, and they are principally used for game management, not all of the other benefits. So they have a place as part of game management, but they also have disbenefits that are well documented through the weight of scientific opinion, some of which we've talked about today, about diminishing the carbon storage on moors, diminishing their water storage, affecting water policy. So you're absolutely right, there are many ways of creating that mosaic of habitat. To repeat the phrase Tony's been used, the complexity we are trying to work out is what is the best way that doesn't have negative impacts as well as positive ones.
Right, okay, I think we could carry on with this, but I feel I would test the patience of my colleagues if we did.
One of your colleagues, of course, had a long session on this with one of our colleagues last week, so there is other stuff on the record from the Environmental Audit Committee last week.
Yes, we saw that too. But for the moment, look, we're very grateful to you for your attendance and for your engagement. We will no doubt opine on this at some future stage, and I would hope that we will be able to continue this engagement in what is a very important area of work in relation to the department. But we are done for today. Order.